Welcome to our Fern Cottage video tour. We won't be able to have our usual open day this year due to the lockdown, so we thought we'd try and do a series of videos giving a bit of a tour of our site and the way that we garden here. We're a permaculture demonstration site, one of the land centres. We demonstrate permaculture here, and we have a design as well for the site which we'll do a video on at some point. So we're starting here in the yard. This is our most used area. This is a family area and all the views from our house are on this small courtyard area, so it has to look really attractive as well as provide some of the functions, some of them for wildlife and some of them food for ourselves. A few features of this: we've got our kale tree. If anyone wants to learn more about perennial kales, how to propagate them, we've already done a video on that, you can see on our YouTube channel. But this is a fantastic feature in the middle, and we've actually found this spring it's absolutely full of birds, so it's provided a fantastic wildlife feature as well as keeping us fed with fresh greens through this period of time where it's actually quite difficult to get hold of fresh vegetables, so that's been fantastic. By raising it up like this, we actually managed to plant an understory underneath. So this kale is Taunton Dean and it has a particularly lax sprawling habit. So if we hadn't staked it like this and crown lifted it, it would take over most of this bed. So by lifting it upwards and using the vertical space, we've managed to plant all sorts of other things underneath. We've got a cutting of it here which we've just pushed into the ground, and when this gets too big and it's already getting to the point where it's struggling to support its own weight, then this cutting will take over and this will die down. In here, some of the flowering perennials I use, I try and have things that have very vertical leaves, so it leaves a bit more space for some of the edibles. So we have things like the iris, and also I've got some things like the hemerocallis, and I've got some camassia as well, which is quamash, these here, and they're some of my favourites. And even though the roots are edible and you can eat them baked, they're just so pretty that I think I'd have to be really starving before I could bring myself to eat these. I thought I'd just come down here to show you how we can use every available space within this area. So some people think of forest gardens as having to include trees and be based on fruit and nut trees and fruit bushes underneath, but here we have the perennial kale as our canopy layer. We have obelisks with things like peas that grow up them. They provide the climbing plants, and then right down here we've got some ground covers. We've got this really beautiful viola, forms this really dense cover so it stops any weeds growing, and the flowers are edible as well, so you can put them in salads or on little cupcakes. We've got things like the wild strawberries, so they sprawl around as well. And then just for a bit of colour and for pollinators, we've got things like this Primula denticulata here, and they're all growing underneath these rosemary bushes here. We've got other herbs as well, like the sage. We've got chives here, and all sorts of other plants growing within this area. And every year I tweak this a little bit, it changes a little bit. Things die off, other things get too vigorous. So it's an ever-changing scene. This fruit tree here, we transplanted this a few years ago, this apple tree, and to be honest we thought we'd killed it because it was just coming into flower when we moved it, which is probably about the worst time to put it in, but we put it in, we pruned it a bit, we picked off some of the flower buds and watered it, and it has actually survived. So this sort of sprawls out over the paving here, so it sort of uses the vertical space here where nothing else will grow, and underneath that we've got all sorts of other plants that are mingling in between. And then over here we've got this perennial kale. It's a variegated Daubenton. This is called panache, and to be honest this is getting a little bit too big for its space now, so I'm thinking of probably, we've got a few plants of it here, I'm thinking of probably taking one out. Over here you can see where it's grown upwards and then a bit like this, and then that's fallen over, and then up from that all these other shoots have come off. So it's a bit of a sprawling plant really here. You can pull these off and stick them in the ground as cuttings, and then you can grow another plant. But here it's just started to get a bit out of hand, and I realised that it has swamped out one of my favourite plants here, which is garlic chives. So it's really getting a bit big for its space, so I'll be cutting that back a bit. Here we garden on a northwest facing slope, so it's quite hard to find a microclimate that pumpkins like, and they're one of our main crops that we eat through the winter, so they're quite an important crop for us. Here we've got a big planter. It works out about 3 square metres in total, and in here we've planted 10 pumpkins. So that seems quite a lot of pumpkins for such a small space. Normally you'd be spacing them at 1 metre plus apart. But here we actually grow them vertically, so we have ropes that come up this frame and out across the yard. So we're using as much of the vertical space as possible, and that means that we can plant quite a few pumpkins in this space, and it provides fantastic screening as well for the house in the summer, so it keeps the rooms cool. We don't even need curtains by the time it gets to about July, August. And here every year we take, after we've harvested the pumpkins, we take the compost from here and we mulch the rest of the yard. So that provides a sort of in situ composting. So in here we pre-germinated the pumpkin seeds, and we will be doing another video on pre-germinating. I just didn't manage to find time this morning. So we've pre-germinated pumpkin seeds, and so we've planted them direct into the soil, and normally it's a bit early to be planting them direct, but here with being in a next to a south facing wall in a sheltered courtyard, and also we have these lights that we put over the top to keep them protected, and we've had quite warm, unseasonably warm weather, so we're going to give it a try. We've also put some in pots so that if we have a late frost and it kills them off, then we've got some to replace them with. So it's just sort of to give us a bit of a head start if possible. You'd be absolutely amazed how quickly a pumpkin seed can put down a taproot. We plant our seeds in deep 3-litre pots, and within days they've already put down a taproot right to the bottom. So if you plant them in these tiny little pots, you quite often see people growing pumpkins in. They're already pot bound within, a day or two of germinating. We've got this bed here which we're going to do a complete rethink of. So our plan is to do a video maybe every 3 or 4 weeks to see the progression of the beds. Here we're really wanting to do a complete reshuffle, a rethink. It's never been a massively successful bed, so we're having a rethink of this. But we will be planting, in all these beds we plant a mixture of the annual vegetables and flowers in amongst all the other perennial flowers as well. So we'll just have to see how that goes. We have this bay tree here, which, just as with the perennial kale, we've crown lifted it so that we can plant things underneath. This is one of my favourite beds in the garden. We have these 2 pears here, Durundo pears, and they're very loosely trained, I would say. They're not in a fancy espalier or anything, but they benefit from this south facing wall here. We have, because these are both Durundo and they need another tree to pollinate them, then we take a branch from another pear tree, a different variety which is growing elsewhere, and then we put it in this jar and we tie it into the tree, and that means when insects are coming to the plants and they're visiting all the different flowers, then they'll visit this one as well. So that's an easy way to cross-pollinate if you haven't got another pear tree nearby, and we found that really made a big difference with our fruit set. So we grow a few different pears here. We've got Berhardi and Beth and Hessel, but this Durundo here is one of my favourites, and when we harvest it we do a lot of dehydrating as well, so we slice it up and dehydrate it, and then we're still eating it now from the pears that we picked earlier in the year. So let's look at just a few other plants that we've got in this bed. Here we used to have a Lobelia tuber, which it wasn't edible in any way, but it was spectacular. So we've got a bit of a gap here that needs filling. It really filled all of this space, so I need to have a rethink about here. I've got this lovely golden oregano here, fantastic scent, and it's just such a vibrant colour. It's really fantastic. I'm going to propagate that and put a few more around the garden. We have some garlic here, just normal garlic that we planted in the ground, and we use it just like chives. It comes up really early, even before the chives, and you can just use it for making garlic bread, mix it in with other herbs. We've got a clematis in here as well, which climbs up the pear. That looks fantastic later in the year. Here I've got Turkish rocket. I have to say it's not one of my favourites. I don't really like the flavour very much. I've heard that if you grow it in a greenhouse or a polytunnel and you pick the leaves while they're still young and fresh, that it can taste quite nice, but I haven't tried that myself yet. Here we've got a delphinium, and I think it just shows how successful the birds are at keeping all the slugs away, that we haven't had to do any slug control at all, and this delphinium looks absolutely fantastic here, not a single slug hole. I need to put a willow frame around it. Unfortunately, this bit of willow here has rooted itself in, so I need to dig that out and start again. But that's fantastic. It's got big blue spires and it looks really spectacular. I've got some of the walking onions here. So they have these fantastic flower heads, which instead of flowers they produce bulbils on the ends, and then they fall down and hit the soil and they'll grow more, and that's why they call them walking onions, because it's a bit like they're spreading themselves around the garden. I've got some of the lobelia tuber in the background there, so at least I've got one left to produce some flowers. And finally, this corner needs a total rethink. I've just let the mint get completely out of hand. I've got two different types of mint here. I've got a Swiss mint and the garden mint. The Swiss mint makes fantastic herbal tea, and the garden mint makes lovely mint sauce. So two different types of mint. They've all got completely mixed together and run completely rampant in this bed. So I really need to have a complete rethink of this and take everything out. I quite often put some peas with obelisks with peas on. You can see this Taunton Dean kale here, which is the same kale that we've got over there, which is raised and we've crown lifted, and here it's taken its natural habitat, which is sprawling mess. It's meant that I can't reach the bed, so I'm going to cut this right back, and it's great because I can use all of these bits. When I cut them back, I can use all of these bits for cuttings to make more plants, so I'll be cutting that right back and redoing this corner. I've got some globe artichokes. They're not the most high yielding vegetable I could put in this space, but they have fantastic architectural ornamental leaves, and I absolutely love eating the flowering heads, so I'll be putting those in that far corner and then working out what I'm going to put around the front of them. And the same here really. We've got this pallet planter here. We've got 3 of these in the yard, and because it's such a small space, we're trying to make the most out of it. We're using the vertical, and we have alpine strawberries, and then we fill in the gaps with other annual things like lettuce and different herbs and flowers like nasturtiums. These are suffering a bit because we just haven't had any rain here for pretty much the entirety of the lockdown, so I'll be replacing a couple of these. And here you can just see the pallet planter is actually 2 pallets. We found that the width of 1 pallet just dried out too quickly, so it's the width of 2 pallets, and then we've put this end on just to stop the soil from falling out, and we've actually made it slightly wider at the bottom so that it won't tip over and squash the kids. So these have worked really well, and you can just lift them up and carry them around if you want to move them around the garden. We've planted the top with these herbs, which are doing really well. So that's the end of the tour for the yard. We're going to do a bit of a tour up the hill, but we're going to do that tomorrow now because we're running out of light. Here is the tree that we've done some top working on. This is an apple tree. We've top worked this 5 or 6 year old seedling. It's a seedling rather than a commercial rootstock because we wanted it to have a tap root. We've got very poor soil here, so we wanted it to have a tap root. So here we've got a cleft graft where you cleave a slit into it and put the sign into that. And then up here we've got some rind grafts where you graft into the bark. And you can see this was done about 4 weeks ago now, and you can see the buds are just starting to burst. Down here we've left a couple of minor branches on as a sap draw, just to help draw the sap up. And now we're going to look at one that was done last year. Here's a tree that was top worked just over 12 months ago. You can see it was on a sturdy, mature tree, so we've managed to get quite a lot of growth in just 12 months. So this here is 12 months worth of growth. So we'll even get, it's starting to flower, so we'll even get a small crop on it this year. And we'll have to deal later on with things like the crossing branches, but you can see they've all taken really well. They're looking very healthy. Here you can see one where we've removed the tape already, so you can see the callousing where it's starting to heal. Rather than just having one, you've got 3 here, and that's to help promote even healing here. So I'll leave these 3 on for now, but in the long term we'll remove 2 out of 3 of these and just have one main branch coming off here. So I've just walked up the fruit walk here where we have the top work trees. So in this fruit walk we've got cherries, pears, apples, medlars, mulberry and some quince, and underneath that we've got things like the canomeles for the japonicas. And I'm just going to walk through the gate and start on our first forest garden patch. So here we're at one of our forest garden patches. So down in the yard, down the hill, we had a much more ornamental forest garden style down there, whereas up here it's much wilder. We planted these trees quite a few years ago straight into turf, into this meadow grass, and rather than trying to mulch out all of the grass, we decided to plant things in that would be self-mulching. So over time these plants have spread and killed off the grass. So we have some lovely plants like this Symphytum hidcut blue. The flowers unfurl with these lovely flowers and the bees absolutely love them. So it's fantastic for attracting pollinators for when the apple trees are flowering. And these have been flowering since so to the end of January. So that's fantastic. You can see here this is the stump from an alder which we coppiced a couple of years ago, and you can see these new shoots that are coming off it. So in another few years, 3 or 4 years, when these get bigger, we'll cut these back as well. That'll release another boost of nitrogen for the fruit trees, and then it'll shoot back all over again. So this is a fantastic tree, this alder, for fixing nitrogen and for being able to coppice. And you can use the coppice branches for making ramial wood chips or for plant supports, all sorts of things. Here we've planted another apple tree. This one's Bardsey Island. Quite often people try and establish their forest garden straight into grass. Really it makes more sense to try and establish the ground cover first, because then even though your trees might be planted a year later, they'll be much happier, so they'll put on much more growth and be much healthier. Here we've also got some Mahonia in the background, also known as Oregon grape, and they produce some fantastic berries. We made some delicious jam from them. We've also got currants, such as this one here. I can't remember if I think that one might be a black currant. And then behind that we've got some Rosa rugosa as well, which is fantastic for making rosehip syrup, and we use that for drizzling on ice cream, things like that. And here you can see the Inula magnifica flower heads. So they really stand for a long time, which provides things like seeds for birds and habitat for different insects. On the other side of the path, where it gets a bit wilder, we've got this Chinomales here. We absolutely love growing japonicas. We've got more than a dozen varieties. We've also grown some of our own from seed, so we're trialling those. We use japonicas in all sorts. We use them to make fruit leather, we've made cordials, we've made jams and jellies. They're absolutely delicious, and even if you just put them in a bowl in your house, the smell of them is absolutely delicious. Quite lemony and very fragrant. Behind that we've got a jostaberry. It's just gone mad. In this area really we never prune any of our fruit. We never really do much to it other than when we strim the paths in this bit of forest garden, we just throw whatever we've strimmed underneath the fruit bushes, and that's all the feeding that they get. And they're always really healthy. We haven't had any problems with pests and disease. And even though it's open to all of the birds, we find that we get enough of a crop for ourselves that we can share some with the birds. This is once again the kale Taunton Dean, just like we had down in the yard. Here it's really sprawling and falling over. It's also been attacked by rabbits down at the bottom, but it's still going and it's still producing a crop. We just struck this straight into the ground here and just left it to it, and it's grown and produced a crop and is doing really well. We don't feed it, prune it or do anything, and it's doing really well. And over here on this wall we've got some hybrid berries. We like to train them along this wall because it's south facing, so it gets a lot of sun. It is starting to get a little bit overgrown with brambles as well, so we definitely need to give this a bit of attention. But other than that, we don't really do anything in this forest garden area. That's annoying. Shall I just carry on? Here we've got a pear, so it's just on the edge of the woodland, so it's still getting plenty of sunlight. Underneath that we've got this raspberry here. This is Autumn Treasure, and that's really good at self-standing, so it doesn't need tying in. However, we have got other raspberries such as All Gold, which have a tendency to fall over. So if you want to do something very simple just to stop them falling over, you can just get a few canes and tie them at the top, and they make their own trellis just like this. So you don't need to put wires or anything complicated into it, just tie them with a bit of string to stop them falling over. Now we're going to try and walk down this path without snagging the microphone cable. I'll do my best. There's all sorts of other shrubs in here. We've got things like Rubus spectabilis, salmonberry. We've also got an aronia, which looks absolutely beautiful when it's flowering, mixed in with some more silver birch. Most of the understory is nettles, but they're fantastic for wildlife, so that's not a problem. We just try and strim this path so that we can get through without nettling ourselves. And then just behind me here we have this fantastic Elaeagnus umbellata. It's one of my favourite shrubs in the garden. Just when it's just coming out in spring, it looks absolutely beautiful with silvery branches, and that's another nitrogen fixing plant. So I can see here I need to tie some of these raspberries up. So these are some of the autumn, some of the All Gold, which don't stand up quite as well. So we're just the other side of the Elaeagnus. I totally failed to get through without tripping over my microphone cable, so here we are on the other side. Here we have an apple meridian, and it forms a really nice guild. So we've got the apple here, the Elaeagnus there which feeds the apple, and the black currant and some raspberries underneath as well. The black currant is in a very shady spot. It barely gets any sun whatsoever, but it still produces a fantastic crop. And the apple as well. I mean, we're a northwest facing slope. We have trees all the way round, so in the winter the sun just skirts underneath the trees, so we never really get any sun. But things like the apples, they don't really mind because they've lost their leaves by that time of year anyway. So even though this is in a less than ideal spot, it still produces a crop. So this guild works really nice together here. And we've also got underneath that, we've got the cleavers, and we've also got the nettles, and they are really good as a kind of chop and drop green mulch, so we can cut those down and mulch around the trees to give them an extra feed if we like. And also we find the nettles growing up around the fruit bushes, and particularly this, because it's so sticky, it forms like its own bird netting, so it keeps the birds from stealing all of your fruit. And just round here we've got our willow coppice. You can see here I was cutting some a few months ago. I haven't got round to moving it yet, but we stuck these willow in a few years ago now. This is a biomass willow, but I also use it for doing sort of willow structures, willow weaving, things like that. So we coppice this area down here, and looking in this area, really it's hard to believe, but when we took the pigs out 9 years ago, there wasn't even a blade of grass in this area, and we've already got, you know, quite a lot of trees, a lot of life, and you can barely see any soil anywhere. So it just shows it doesn't take that long to establish something quite sizable. We're really lucky that we have some woodland behind us, and before, when we first moved here, all of this was just pasture, so it was just grazed grass, and there was sort of woodland and grass and nothing in between. So what we've created really is this woodland edge, so like a young woodland, and it's been really easy for the wildlife to move in here. We've had a lot of owls, birds of prey, we have buzzards circling round. We've even just had a kestrel have chicks, and they've just fledged from a tree just down the hill, which has been fantastic homeschool learning for the kids. So it's just really lovely to have that. We've got down here this gooseberry black velvet, so that's a cross between a gooseberry and a Worcesterberry, and it's really productive, very vigorous, but it produces very tiny gooseberries, and which are also very painful to try and harvest. So we don't really harvest a lot from this area, but it makes a fantastic shrubby area which is really good for wildlife. Here we are right at the top of the hill. This is where we have our vegetable garden. It's miles from the house, but it's actually the sunniest, flattest area we have on the whole bit of land. So this is where we have our vegetables. We've created this vegetable garden with a fence and a bit of a windbreak. It gets quite breezy up here, although we're actually very lucky we're sheltered from the hill just over there. And we also have rabbits and deer, so we've put a fence around it just to keep it secure. This section here we've got potatoes. Even though it hasn't rained for about 4 weeks now, under this mulch of grass, it's actually the soil's still really damp, so there's still plenty of moisture under there. So we've planted the potatoes and mulched them with a mixture of grass clippings and also a mixture of our own compost, which is the chicken manure mixed with dead leaves. So that's provided a really good mulch and also will feed the potatoes. Further down we've got some garlic and onions growing and a few raspberries around the end, and then this side is mulched out ready to have some pumpkins in here. So later on in the year you won't be able to see the ground because of all the pumpkin leaves, so that's something to look forward to. So it looks a bit bare and unproductive at the moment, but it'll be a fantastic area later on in the year. Here we've got our raspberry patch. It's looking a bit scruffy. We never get round to cutting it back, but it doesn't seem to be of any detriment to it. Over here we've got our alder hedge. So we planted that as a windbreak and it works really well. But also because it's nitrogen fixing, we've planted some other things in amongst it, things like mirabelles. We've even had some perennial kale in there. So when we cut it back, it will feed those plants and give them a boost of nitrogen. On the other side here we have this fantastic coppice hazel. I'm really excited about getting the first coppice off here, and it's covered in bluebells underneath. The bluebells are just coming out here, whereas in a lot of places they've already gone over. As I said earlier, we're quite high up here and northwest facing, so the bluebells come out quite late. We planted these hazels straight into the grass. We didn't do any of the usual spraying around the base with chemicals or even mulching them out with cardboard. We just put them straight in the ground, and they probably are behind by a year or so, but you know, when your time is limited, it's better to just get them in the ground and hope for the best, and they're doing really well here, so I'm really pleased with this. So here we are in the polytunnel. It's lovely and calm in here. We've got lots of things that have been growing through the winter. So we've got things like our kales and Swiss chard. And these kales have been fantastic. They've kept us going all winter, and now we're eating tons of these flowering shoots as well. So you can still eat them when the flower buds have opened, but if you get them just at this stage, and all the different kales have different coloured shoots. And they're all delicious. So as you can see, all the kales are flowering now, so we're busy eating all of the shoots. The more you pick them, the more they flower. We have pits in here where we will be planting the tomatoes quite soon. It's always a bit of a dilemma this time of year. At what point do you pull everything else out and put the tomatoes in? We'll be keeping some of the Swiss chard in here, but many of the kales are just so big now that they'd swamp out the tomatoes, so they'll be coming out, but they'll be going over soon anyway because they're finishing flowering. And in here we have a mulch of ramial wood chip. I won't go into too much detail right now, but it's not just chipped bark, it's wood that's chipped with the wood that you're chipping has a diameter of 7 centimetres or less, so the ratio of the hard inner core to the sappy bark is different, so it makes a really good mulch and feeds the soil. So that's what we use in here. And then because we've had a problem with moles in the past, and one year we had some moles in and they literally followed the irrigation, we have drip irrigation, they followed the irrigation pipes along, getting all the worms when it was really dry a few years ago, just like it is now, and they just went straight through all the roots of the tomatoes that we'd planted in, and we had to replant. Luckily we'd grown plenty of extra. So to try and stop that being a problem, if I can find it under all this, we've got some baskets which are made of chicken wire, and what we found is that the one time that a mole did get in, it just got fed up with bumping into all these baskets of chicken wire, and it just left. So we plant all our tomatoes, we dig all of this out and replace it with some really good homemade compost, and then plant our tomatoes into that so that they're not going to get attacked by the moles. So at some point in the next few weeks we'll be taking most of this out and putting the tomatoes in, and hopefully when we do our next tour we'll have all our tomatoes in and it'll be looking a lot neater in here, and these will probably finish flowering and we'll probably be really sick of eating kale flowers by then. So we'll go back down the hill now and we'll just show you very briefly our back garden and what we might be doing in there in the next few weeks. So now I'm in the greenhouse. It's attached to our kitchen, which makes it really handy for picking the produce when it's growing, but also because we've got this wall here, it collects heat during the day and then gives it out at night, so it keeps it nice and frost free. So this year we're growing a lot of tomatoes. For the first time we're growing some dwarf tomatoes from the dwarf tomato breeding project. We haven't grown these before, so we're going to see how they do. When I say dwarf tomatoes, I don't mean like literally dwarf tomatoes. It's the usual big sprawling indeterminate tomatoes, but on shorter bushier plants, so they will hopefully be easier to manage and higher yielding for the amount of space that they take up. In here we've also got the same raymeal wood chips that we've got up in the polytunnel to mulch the soil, and that keeps the moisture in, but also it stops the soil splash when we're watering the tomatoes. Our new project for this year is our so-called victory garden. So we're trying to grow a lot more produce than we normally would this year, with fresh produce being in short supply. It's always been a bit of an unused space out here, so we've put in these 2 brand new raised beds. Luckily for us, we just before the lockdown we'd had delivered 5-ton bags of veggie soil and also some spent mushroom compost. So in here I've been sowing things that would be harder to look after up the hill, so things like carrots that are more prone to getting eaten by slugs. So I've just got some carrots emerging now. We sowed these after pre-germinating them, and I'll do a bit more about pre-germinating on another post. So I've got these in here. The only problem I'm having now is I put this netting on because we seem to be having a problem with rats digging in pots, but unfortunately they've just made holes in my netting, so I'm now going to have to make some chicken wire netting to put over these beds to make sure the rats don't eat anything. But hopefully over the next few weeks we'll be sorting this garden out, putting another few raised beds in here, tidying it up a bit. So yeah, watch this space and we'll see what it looks like in another month's time. I'm down here at our propagating bench. It's a real privilege to be down here. Andrew doesn't normally let me near his seedlings. It's a really great way to propagate things down here. It's a nice constant temperature and humidity, and we have these LED lights here to give the light. We were growing our tomatoes on here, but now that they've been moved and potted up into the greenhouse, it means we can put these seedlings in here. So I've got these trays here, these module packs, and they've got chard and beetroot in. Here we've managed to grow 40 different types of kale, so we've used these modules here, and then we just sow a few in each so that we can grow. We like to, trial new varieties and have different varieties, so we've managed to get 40 within just these few cell trays. We were quite late with sowing our leeks, so it's really brought them on down here just to get them started. And over here we've got some melon and cucumber rootstock. So we've grown grafted tomatoes a lot in the past. Grafting things like tomatoes and melons and cucumbers onto rootstocks really helps with the disease resistance and the vigour of the plant, so it's really worthwhile. We found, particularly with the tomatoes, that we get double the crop per plant if they're grafted onto a vigorous rootstock. So we've not done this with melons or cucumbers before, so that's something, Andrew will be grafting these plants, so that's something we're trialling this year. And lastly, we're back down the hill, and here we are in the nursery. So we've got all sorts of plants that we've grown from seed, things like this Szechuan pepper. We've got seedling crab apples, pears, all sorts in here. So we're going to try and do a video about once a month, another tour, just so you can see how things are developing and changing and growing. If there's anything in particular that you want to know about, then please just let us know in the comments and we'll try and fit it into another video in the future. Thanks.